Subscriptions. Written by the Westering Sun. Despite many attempts to explain the rise of woke, there remains little agreement about what it actually is. This may be because we have yet to find the right framework. In The Machiavellians, James Burnham argued that politics is not a competition between abstract principles. Instead, most political discourse seeks to obscure the question of who rules and on whose behalf. Even political language about peace, justice, or equality routinely masks the struggle for power. Burnham championed the Machiavellian tradition, which is based on political realism. Crucially, Machiavellian thinkers argue that ideologies do not guide the use of power so much as they justify status and control in moral language. For while politicians typically claim to serve society at large, in practice they tend to serve particular groups at the expense of others. From this perspective, the Reformation was not just a spiritual awakening, it was a rationalization of the bourgeoisie's ascendance over the universal church. Enlightenment liberalism, meanwhile, broadly served to justify the ascent of the commercial class against the aristocracy. One of Burnham's key influences was Vilfredo Pareto, a polymath who conceived social behavior as shaped by two forces, residues and derivations. Residues reflect the deep, unspoken impulses that drive behavior, such as the instinct to preserve our physical security, property, or territory. Derivations, meanwhile, are the surface rationalizations that mask instinctive drives beneath appeals to morality, fairness, or other general standards. Pareto observed that every ruling class advances their interests through a complex network of derivations that present their actions as serving the public good, while in practice fortifying their own position. When we consider ideologies like multiculturalism, anti-racism, and most recently woke, we ought to ask, cui bono? What interests are these ideologies rationalizing, and what social forces do they represent? Demographic change and the rise of multiculturalism. In recent decades, Western societies have undergone unprecedented demographic transformation. Since the 1990s, virtually every Western nation has experienced a rapid and likely permanent increase in both the unassimilated immigrant and mixed-race populations. This was a largely unanticipated consequence of two factors: a sharp acceleration in non-white immigration combined with the reversal of taboos against racial intermarriage. Though largely unforeseen and never legitimized by democratic mandate, demographic transformation was swiftly rationalized and sanctified through the ideology of multiculturalism. This was presented as a natural extension of the liberal rational belief that social life should be governed by neutral principles, procedural justice, and abstract equality. In truth, multiculturalism represented the culmination of a worldview that had long pathologized in-group preference and delegitimized ancestral identity. By suppressing traditional language rooted in attachment, loyalty, and exclusion, liberal rationalism had already disarmed the West's native populations in the face of a doctrine that presented demographic upheaval as a form of moral progress. In the 1990s, multiculturalism became entrenched as the dominant ideological framework across the West. Samuel Huntington described how a concentrated and sustained onslaught by intellectuals and publicists led to multiculturalism being formally adopted by the Clinton administration, which made the encouragement of diversity one of its major goals. Meanwhile, in Britain, Tony Blair's Labour government oversaw a dramatic expansion of immigration, inaugurating an era of demographic transformation. Other Western nations soon followed. Advocates of multiculturalism presented it as neutral, benevolent, and inclusive. Yet from a Machiavellian or realist perspective, it was anything but neutral. In instrumental terms, it sanctified unassimilated minorities, immigrants, and mixed-race individuals by implicitly identifying them as the future of Western nations. The empowerment of these groups socially, politically, and institutionally was justified at the expense of native majorities. While formerly marginal groups benefited materially and otherwise from multiculturalism, they were not its architects. Nor did they possess the political or institutional leverage to establish it as a new paradigm for Western civilization. The task of authoring, enforcing, and entrenching multiculturalism as state dogma fell to another group entirely: the managerial regime. The managerial regime is the bureaucratic, credentialed, and increasingly transnational class that governs Western societies. Its members typically occupy permanent, unelected positions in the civil service, corporate management, finance, technology, academia, the media, and key parts of the military, mainstream church, and trade union bureaucracy. Despite their power and responsibility, they feel little loyalty to Western nations, cultures, or peoples. Rather than cultivating traditional symbolic legitimacy, they govern through surveillance, regulation, and linguistic control. Their authority comes less from the explicit consent of the governed than from the strategic manipulation of media narratives, control of information systems, and bureaucratic and legal mechanisms designed to suppress dissent. A new ruling coalition. Multiculturalism served the concrete interests of two distinct but aligned forces, operating within a patron-client relationship. The growing demographic bloc of unassimilated immigrants, minorities, and liminal individuals of mixed descent, seeking recognition, protection, and access to institutions within societies they did not build, the client. The managerial elite, whose power depends on dissolving organic social attachments and managing fragmented populations incapable of coordinated resistance, the patron. Multiculturalism therefore served a dual purpose. It functioned as a vehicle of upward mobility and symbolic recognition for client groups and as a mechanism of control for the managerial regime. It provided ideological justification for demographic transformation, elevating liminal identities while delegitimizing the ancestral identities of the West's majority populations. It weakened the cohesion and group solidarity of these native majorities and reinforced the anathematization of strong, effective expressions of majority identity, whether framed in ethnic, national, or religious terms. As a result, Western countries could no longer be coded in public discourse as either white or Christian. In place of organic sources of belonging such as family, faith, and nation, multiculturalism fostered clientelism. Where Western countries once encouraged assimilation, this was now discouraged. Instead, minorities and liminal groups were increasingly framed as sacred victims who depended on the regime for recognition, advancement, and protection. In effect, the regime generated social fragmentation while selling elite mediation as the indispensable solution, thereby securing the role of the managerial class as arbiter of the new demographic order. Immigrants, minorities, and people of mixed descent assumed central symbolic roles within the new regime. Their very existence was cast as a living refutation of traditional or nationalist narratives. Under the mantra of diversity, moral progress and the end of racism meant the erasure of majority identity. In Machiavellian terms, multiculturalism served the interests of a new ruling coalition liminal clients and their elite patrons, just as earlier ideologies had served specific groups in other eras. By empowering liminal identities as regime clients, multiculturalism offered moral justification and institutional pathways for minorities and their descendants, while simultaneously weakening the cohesion of native majorities. In doing so, it allowed the managerial class to consolidate its authority by presenting itself as the indispensable mediator of the very demographic and cultural tensions it promoted. The displacement of the core population. This new consensus effectively unified the interests of three distinct groups: the managerial, bureaucratic, technocratic elite, client groups, immigrants, minorities, and liminal identities, who derived status and material benefits from elite patronage. Ideological enablers, typically downwardly mobile whites embedded in academia, media, and NGOs. If these groups are abstracted from the social equation, what remains of Western societies largely amounts to the shrinking mass of the traditional population. This core or host population then emerges as the universal object of exploitation across the West. Predominantly native, often middle or working class, and still retaining residual loyalties to older forms of nationhood, faith, and organic order, this group's economic productivity funds the regime and supports its clients. Its demographic inertia is invoked to justify mass migration, while its defensive political instincts are pathologized as reactionary or extremist. It bears the brunt of taxation, undergoes cultural and demographic displacement, and faces escalating surveillance and censorship. This dynamic constitutes the sociological foundation of anarcho-tyranny. This also explains why traditional left-right distinctions feel increasingly meaningless to many people. Conventional politics no longer reflect the fundamental axis of conflict when the system is structured around exploiting the core population for the benefit of a hostile managerial regime and its dependent clients. The dynamic of exploitation generates tension between those who suffer and those who benefit. This is frequently perceived in racial terms and often maps along racial lines. But the deeper cleavage is civilizational, between those loyal to the old metaphysical and cultural order of the West and those employed in its deconstruction. Historically, and to some extent even today, some individuals from minority, immigrant, or mixed backgrounds have assimilated into the native majority through intermarriage, cultural adoption, or shared ancestry. But such organic assimilation threatens managerial interests. because it reinforces cohesion within the traditional population and undermines the regime's strategy of using liminal groups as wedges to fragment solidarity. For the managerial regime, multiculturalism offered a way to sabotage assimilation. This helps explain the vehemence with which its acolytes denounce members of liminal groups who identify with the native majority, branding them as traitors, Uncle Toms, white supremacists, and so on. Such language serves a counterentropic function for ethnic partisans who seek to prevent defection and protect group boundaries. But it also reveals the bigotry of managerial despotism, aimed at those who want to belong rather than serve. The reactionary turn of the regime. Multiculturalism remained the dominant ideology of Western societies until the mid-2010s. Around 2016, however, something changed and a more militant successor emerged, the phenomenon now known as woke. The origins of woke are commonly traced to critical theories developed within academia. It is sometimes portrayed as a moral awakening, or, depending on perspective, as either an extension or betrayal of liberal values. Instead, it should be understood as a defensive ideological consolidation. The ruling coalition, liminal identity groups and their managerial patrons, embraced woke as a strategic response to growing native resistance. Woke marked a definitive ideological hardening, which transformed multiculturalism into a rigid and explicitly authoritarian moral framework, designed not merely to advance but to defend a fragile new class structure. In retrospect, 2016 was an inflection point in Western history. Years of growing frustration over mass immigration, cultural dispossession, and the erosion of national identity culminated in two seismic events: the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the US. These embodied the first major mass resistance from native Western populations against globalism, demographic transformation, and cultural subordination. These events triggered existential anxiety for the managerial regime and its clients. It became clear that the core population still possessed substantial numbers and latent political power, that democratic processes might enable their resurgence, and that the ideological high ground needed immediate fortification. Managerial elites therefore pivoted to woke ideology as a reactionary move, launching a moral crusade designed to embed their ideological regime as a permanent revolution. Their aim was preemptive suppression of native resurgence-crushing dissent from the only quarter capable of challenging their ascendancy. Where multiculturalism was ostensibly concerned with integration, tolerance, and minority legitimation, woke was about consolidation and control. It functioned as the ideological shock troop of the managerial regime, constituting a form of psychological warfare directed specifically against the core population. Its purpose was to prevent the reemergence of coherent national identity rooted in traditional Western symbolism and organic order. Woke ideology was broadly embraced by elites drawn from regime client groups. Having gained institutional power and moral primacy in public life, and sensing that this new status might be vulnerable, they switched from demanding recognition to asserting dominance, often through aggressive institutional and rhetorical tactics. For them, woke was never about idealism or justice. It was a class reflex prompted by confidence in recent gains and the fear of reversal. Woke should be understood by its instrumental function as a tool of power. It operates through ideological inversion. Minorities become majorities first symbolically, then institutionally. Victimhood becomes moral authority, tradition becomes oppression, and normativity becomes violence. These inversions are designed to delegitimize the core population's attachment to its own traditions and identity. Opposition is never engaged through debate but branded as hatred, coded as fascism or white supremacy, and banished from public discourse. The goal is not persuasion, but the systematic dehumanization and suppression of resistance. The managerial class profits doubly, first through symbolic control and second through institutional expansion. DEI regimes, HR departments, and ESG compliance structures create sprawling bureaucracies that entrench ideological orthodoxy and reward loyalists. These apparatuses supply moral training and ideological indoctrination across media, technology, law, and academia, reinforcing the regime's grip on public life while creating endless opportunities for patronage. This makes woke the ideological superstructure of a new pan-Western ruling coalition. It justifies elite authority by morally discrediting the majority population while foreclosing the return of coherent national narratives or traditional identity. It is regime logic born from the convergence of demographic transformation, technological control, and symbolic inversion. The capture of millennial radicalism. Beneath the managerial class and its growing client block of liminal groups lies a third critical component: the young, downwardly mobile population of educated whites. This group, which might otherwise have been receptive to populism or class revolt, was instead co-opted as a quasi-religious auxiliary to the regime, tasked with moral enforcement and ideological policing. The 2008 financial crisis was a key catalyst. This blighted the prospects of an entire generation. The millennials then triggered widespread frustration about living standards and anxiety about the future. These sentiments found early expression in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and later in surging support for anti-capitalist figures such as Bernie Sanders in the US and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Crucially, these movements were not initially about identity politics. They were authentic expressions of economic despair and anti-oligarchic revolt, and for a moment they threatened to reorient Western politics around material inequality rather than identity. In Britain, entire friendship groups of previously apolitical, white millennial graduates were mobilized to join the Labour Party specifically to support Jeremy Corbyn's candidacy. This briefly hinted at the potential for a class-based realignment of Western politics. Whatever its wider consequences may have been, this undoubtedly posed a threat to the incumbent managerial regime. This was intolerable to media and political elites, who moved swiftly to neutralize the danger by weaponizing identity politics. Media campaigns rapidly amplified sectional grievances around race and gender, aiming to fracture emerging class solidarity before it could take form. This strategy proved highly effective. Many young, disaffected whites found status not through rebellion against the elite, but through allegiance to it, on the condition they renounce ancestral identity and perform symbolic allyship. Radical economic demands were absorbed, diluted and transformed through rituals of equity such as diversity audits, privilege workshops, and moral posturing. In effect, woke transmuted an entire generation of potential rebels into ideological enforcers for managerial interests. Instead of challenging oligarchy, they became its moral auxiliaries, policing cultural norms, enforcing compliance, and participating in public performances of self-redemption. This neutralized the radical potential of credentialed but increasingly desperate white millennials, precisely those who might otherwise have spearheaded populist resistance. Woke offered them belonging within an elite-coded moral universe and easy access to social status through virtue signaling, activism, and ritual denunciation of working-class whites, now stigmatized as racist, backward, and dangerous. Psychologically rewarding, socially prestigious, and intellectually undemanding, woke was the perfect counterfeit for genuine rebellion. Attachment-based language and civilizational defense. The success of multiculturalism, and its later, more militant incarnation as woke reveals something deeper about the conditions that allow ideological capture. These ideologies did not triumph solely because of elite maneuvering or demographic change. They succeeded because Western societies had already lost their fundamental linguistic and emotional defenses. To understand why woke took root so aggressively, we must examine the collapse of attachment-based language, a mode of speech and thought centered around loyalty, kinship, memory, and obligation. This form of language functions as a sociological immune system, providing instinctive resistance to symbolic inversion and social fragmentation. When it is suppressed or dismantled, societies become acutely vulnerable to ideological capture. Over many years, Western liberal rationalism systematically repressed and displaced this protective linguistic structure. Far from being neutral, liberalism functioned as a slow-acting solvent, gradually dissolving the bonds of memory, kinship, and obligation that made Western liberty meaningful and sustainable. In time, liberalism became a weapon of managerial power, and its suppression of attachment-based language became nothing short of a civilizational extinction mechanism. While purporting to uphold abstract logic and universal moral imperatives, liberal rationalism ended up delivering new effective commitments in the form of replacement ideologies like multiculturalism and woke. If traditional attachment-based language had retained a robust presence in the West, the core claims of woke ideology, white privilege, the patriarchy, 50 genders, etc., would have been instinctively rejected. Not through rational argument, but through ridicule, disgust, or quiet contempt. In fact, this is precisely what blunted a previous wave of political correctness in the early 1990s. This was not halted by intellectual debate, but stalled because traditional language and moral intuitions still carried immunological weight. Some commentators interpret the earlier refusal to engage with politically correct nonsense as a sign of weakness or complacency. In truth, the capacity to deflect ideological attacks without engaging them was a sign of strength. Some might object that managerial elites do promote effective attachment at least among certain client groups, particularly ethnic minorities. And at the individual level, some woke activists are sincerely invested in these identities. But at the regime level, attachment is cynically deployed, not authentically embraced. Identities are treated as strategic instruments, battering rams that fracture the cohesion of the West's historical majorities, who remain the only long-term obstacle to managerial control. The regime does not identify with its mascots. It does not share their fate. Its obligations towards these groups are temporary, instrumental, and conditional. The attachment it displays is purely performative, lasting only so long as it serves managerial interests. Client groups can be discarded or redefined at will whenever strategic priorities shift. Consider women. For decades, promoting female autonomy served as a means to weaken traditional male authority, family structures, and cultural norms. Yet when trans identities emerged as a more potent ideological wedge, women's interests were abruptly sidelined. Their identity previously useful became inconvenient, so their attachment to it was destabilized. The managerial regime simply redefined what it meant to be a woman, dissolving the concept as a coherent social and symbolic form. In doing so, it delegitimized women's attachment to their previous organic identity, just as it had done with the West's traditional ethnic and national identities. Simulacra and strategic emotion. The native majorities of the West differ fundamentally from the regime's client groups because they pose a latent threat to managerial control. This is not due to what they might demand, but what they might remember. Their identity is rooted in historical continuity, shared memory, and implicit solidarity qualities inherently resistant to bureaucratic mediation. For this reason, managerial elites try to suppress their traditional attachments and replace them with ersatz identities that offer no challenge to their authority. The regime's true loyalty is never to a consistent moral vision, but always to the maintenance and expansion of managerial authority. This accounts for the manic, performative, and ritualistic quality of elite discourse, often reminiscent of propaganda cycles in late-stage communist regimes. The constant linguistic shifts, rapid promotion and abandonment of various causes, and selective deployment of outrage are not meant to establish consistent moral order, but to destabilize it. These campaigns do not reflect sincere conviction. Rather, effect itself has become a tool of control weaponized against internal enemies and artificially manufactured to manipulate mass sentiment, all in service of regime consolidation. This also explains why the regime's emotional investments feel uncanny. They are not organic. They are not real. They are simulacra, performances choreographed for instrumental ends. Yet the brittle, punitive tone of managerial propaganda betrays an underlying anxiety. The opposition has not been totally extinguished, because the destruction of the traditional form of Western civilization is not yet irreversible. The regime operating system. Woke is the militant form of multiculturalism, post-Minus 2016. Viewed through a Machiavellian lens, its purpose is straightforward. It is the regime's emergency ideology, used to legitimize a newly ascendant elite, suppress native resurgence, and consolidate managerial control over a fragmented and disoriented society. This framework explains not only why woke emerged, and when, but why it took such an authoritarian and brittle form. It also clarifies the task ahead. Woke is not a phase. It is the operating system of a new hegemonic coalition, one that intends to rule in perpetuity. It cannot be defeated through argument because it is not grounded in intellectual conviction. It is a mechanism of power, a strategy of class insulation, demographic consolidation, and institutional control. The first step in resisting woke is rejecting its moral frame. This means speaking with a different voice and invoking a symbolic language rooted in tradition, continuity, and ancestral loyalty. But in the end, only power can check power. We will need counter-elites and parallel institution schools, platforms, churches, media, and civic networks guided by a language older, deeper, and more resistant to ideological